Welcome to Practicing the Practices, a learning and experiential podcast geared towards helping you apprentice with Jesus. My name is Brad, and I'll be your host and coach today. In today's episode, we turn our attention to an exciting yet intimidating aspect of our apprenticeship to Jesus. Most of our episodes thus far have focused on the internal work of spiritual formation, but today we're flipping the script and we're looking at the outward work of spiritual formation. Specifically, we're talking about living our lives on mission for Jesus, but not just for Jesus, but with Jesus. Joining me today is my good friend and colleague, Kyle Landis. Kyle, welcome to Practicing the Practices.
Thanks so much. This is great.
Well, we've been friends for a long time. We've also been work colleagues. But for those who might not know you, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, so my name is Kyle. I'm married to Christy, who happens to be a pastor at Fellowship Middlebrook. That's where I serve as the pastor of church mobilization. I've got two kids. I've got a senior in high school. She's about to launch, Mia, and I've got a son who is a sophomore who's about to drive. So there's a lot of tears and sadness at my house, and at the same time, lots of joy and excitement. I did have here in my notes that I wanted to let people know that I like long walks on the beach. I like apple pie, and I like to go to the movies and get popcorn and eat all the popcorn for myself. And so
that's really good information. And also, you're not originally from Tennessee. Where do you hail from?
That's right. So my last stop was in Northeast Pennsylvania, where I had a chance to be a church planter there. But prior to that, I'm from Philadelphia area, which is Bucks County for people who know that region. But
yeah, and so sometimes when your parents come to visit, your mom brings all of these special pastries. Maybe just take 30 seconds and tell us about some special Midwestern Pennsylvania fare.
Yeah, so it would be southeastern Pennsylvania, the Bucks County. So you could be talking about shoe fly pie, funny cake, any sticky buns, cream puffs.
I'm not sure people on the podcast would know what those are. Let's take shoe fly pie. Just tell us, what is that?
Yeah, so shoe fly pie is delicious. Actually, I'd rather talk about a cream puff because I think...
Let's go cream puff.
Yeah, so cream puff is a pastry that is baked in the oven, cut in half, filled with some sort of yellow custard, and then doused in chocolate. And Grandma Landis brings lots of treats when she comes.
That sounds amazing and also like a caloric disaster.
That's exactly what it is.
Awesome.
Home sweet home.
Well, Kyle, today we're talking about mission, living on mission, and there are very few people I know who live as purposefully and as faithfully as you do in regards to how they posture themselves towards their neighbor, towards the people in their community, and really live out this life of being on mission. So to get us started, do me a favor, just to help answer this question. When we're talking about mission or living a life that is on mission, what are we even talking about?
Yeah, so I mean, I think you'd find a range of answers to that. And so I was trying to think of a succinct way to say it. And here's how I would describe living on mission. A life on mission has several components to it, but it has to include these components. It's a lifestyle where you are intentionally living, acting, or communicating the gospel of Jesus with others. So you look at those three components. It's a part of your lifestyle. It is an action. How am I acting out? And then, of course, it's got to include the gospel. You know, you can get lots of different versions of life on mission, but if you don't have those three components, I think you're missing a lot. But by definition, I think the practice of living on mission would require you to be with other people. Like, that is the definition of it. You don't live on mission in a vacuum. And even when you look at Jesus and the way that he trained his disciples to live on mission, he was always doing it in a place where there were other people, whether they were homeless, broken, sinful, sick, orphaned, widows, outcasts. All of the ways that Jesus taught his disciples to practice out living on mission included lots of other people. That's probably how I'd best define that.
Well, I think that's really helpful because sometimes when people hear the term spiritual formation, or maybe discipleship is more common to people's vernacular, they just imagine a person with their Bible, maybe a notepad, they're praying, it can almost take on this connotation of spiritual wellness. But in the fullness of what it means to follow the way of Jesus, there is this aspect of our spiritual formation, our becoming like Jesus, that also means we do the things Jesus did, right?
Yeah, and I think that's kind of the component of it. Jesus's classroom was in the midst of other people. Constantly seeing Jesus referring to people around him that are paralyzed or that are deaf or however it might be. And so, like, you look at Jesus's classroom, and it was rarely, let's sit here, grab your textbooks. Rather, it was, hey, follow me and watch what I'm about to do, and then I want you to do what I do. And so, yeah, and I think when you talk about living on mission, you see these particular components that Jesus would often act out with other people and interact with.
I think that's super important, because when you look at the life of Jesus from a 30,000-foot view, even when you just think about the incarnation from a theological context, Jesus, early on, there's Sabbath that's being practiced, there's fasting, there's this time away, there's this prayer with the Father, but it is not in there. That spiritual renewal, that learning to walk with the Spirit, that knowledge of the Word is so that we might then, as Jesus did, begin ministry. Like Jesus left the wilderness, he went to the wilderness to get with the Father so that he could leave the wilderness to get with the neighbors.
Yeah, and so there are a couple things that you see in the way that Jesus interacted with his neighbors, the way that you describe it. And I would say there's several things that you see consistent with the way that Jesus interacts in his life on mission. And I'll just highlight three of them here for a moment. You always see that one of the things that was so crucial with the way that Jesus was on mission was the way that he postured himself with people around him. He would posture himself. The story of the woman in John chapter 8 who's been caught in adultery. What does Jesus do? He goes next to her and he kneels down. He postures himself with her. The woman that he sees at the well, he postures himself. You find him constantly, even in his physical appearance, posturing himself with others around him and showing the disciples, this is how we're going to do it. A second thing that you see is the way that Jesus is always present with people in front of him. The idea of, even the Henry Nouwen idea of ministry of presence. In our department, we run global missions trips. And oftentimes we'll go to a homeless camp or we'll go to a dump city in Mexico, and people will say to me, are we even making a difference here? Like, in this mass sea of poverty and sickness and in some cases death, what are we doing here? Are we getting anything accomplished? And often I will remind them, it is our impact is such a small drop in the ocean, but to the person that's sitting in front of us, it could mean all the world. To put your hands on someone who is scraping by, collecting trash, and holding their hands and saying, you are loved by Jesus, like the impact you're making. So just that idea of being present with the person in front of you.
And I think you said there were three. So you posture yourself with others. You're present with the people that are in front of you right there. What else?
Yeah, and I think this is the piece that, we're in the midst of a missional movement. We're in the midst of an incarnational movement where we're seeing people saying, I want to be more engaged with the lost community around me. I want to be more engaged with my neighbors. And that's terrific. And you'll hear stories of inviting your neighbor over for dinner or being engaged with somebody at the bus stop. And all of those things are about Jesus' posture, about being present. But one of the things that you see that Jesus does that cannot be missed and it can't be overlooked when living on mission is that Jesus always, that's not true. Jesus often leads with grace and concludes with truth. So he always, in the case of the broken, the homeless, the sinful, the outcasts, with them, he leads with grace and concludes with truth. And, of course, with the religious scholars, he often would lead with truth. Yeah. So in those cases, it was different. But I think that's what's so crucial for us today in thinking about living on mission is, yes, we need to posture ourselves with people around us. Yes, we need to be present with the people in front of us. But at the same time, we must be ready to communicate the truth of the gospel.
That's fantastic. So on our last episode, one of the things that we said about community was that God designed us and made us for it. Like it's not something that's an option, that you can check and say, I might choose to do this. If you're going to follow Jesus in his way, not some sort of customized version that you have conjured up, but if you're going to actually follow the Jesus of the Bible, it's absolutely essential that you live your life in a sense where there is this deep sense of community in the body of Christ. In the same vein, in that same absolutism, we are not following Jesus if our only presence, if our only contact is with believers who are just like us. Matter of fact, Jesus said, what's the big deal if you love the people who are just like you, who are your friends? You are called to love your enemy, to go to the Samaritan, to go to the homeless, to go to the stranger, to go to the sinner, to go to the person who might be on the outcast. It is not just something that varsity level mature Christians do, but really one of the things that we see in the Gospels is it's almost instantaneous. Someone encounters Jesus, they experience the beauty, the wonder, the rescue of Jesus, and their immediate disposition is then to go to their family, to their neighbor, to the community, to the town square, and say, "Let me tell you about this guy. I actually don't know all the right theology about him. You've got some questions that I can't answer. All I know is I was blind, but now I see." And so let's talk just for a moment then what it might look like for us then, those who want to follow Jesus, for us to practice a life of mission in just our everyday, ordinary life. Kyle, what does that look like for you? And then how might you help us think about what it looks like for us to live on mission today?
I think one thing that you said that needs to be repeated, and maybe repeated in a more even succinct way than that, is that too often we give the idea that life on mission can be organic and that I can just let it come to me. But the truth is that Jesus didn't do things organically. He did things intentionally. And so if we are going to sit in our pews at our churches and go home, get in our car and drive home and close the garage door behind us and never open our doors to our neighbor and live an organic life, there are very slim possibilities of our neighbors tripping into our home and us having a chance to be on mission.
That's good.
And so I think that's what you just said, I think is so crucial, is that Jesus was intentional. We also need to be intentional. Yeah. And so intentional lifestyle begins with praying. We've got to ask and listen to the Spirit in our lives to say, Lord, who are you going to put in front of me? And in my personal life, I share this often, but on the APAST, the test about apostle, prophet, evangelist, shepherd, teacher, I'm an evangelist. And so I thrive off of having conversations about Jesus with people who are far from Jesus. And so if I wake up in the morning and I feel this dread and this I can't get going, often I'll say to the Lord, God, what's going on? And he'll remind me, you're not spending time with lost people. Wow. And so I'll pray, God, would you put a lost person in my path today? Would you put somebody in my path? And so I think for people who are participating and trying to learn how to be on mission, first it's just saying, God, who are you putting in front of me? Give me the eyes to see who's standing in front of me right now. So that'd be number one.
But before you go to number two, let me just ask you a follow-up question. Not everybody who's listening is going to have the gifting of an evangelist. You just described that, you love and enjoy talking with people who might not know Jesus, about Jesus. For others, that might be, that might create some anxiety. That might not be their natural bent. There's no excuse, but has that always been true for you? Or is this kind of zeal for evangelism and connection, is it something that the Lord kind of matured and brought about? What would you attribute that to?
Yeah, that's a good question. I probably not. I probably didn't as a teenager. As a matter of fact, growing up, I think sharing my faith, talking about Jesus was not on the forefront of my mind. I would say this, though. The more I prayed about God putting people in my path, the more it kind of added to this adventure in life. And so, it can be really scary. I get asked all the time, if I don't have an evangelism bent. I'm worried that I'm going to be asked a question. I don't want to share my faith because I'm afraid somebody will ask me about my faith or a question about God that I don't know the answer to, and I don't want to put myself in that position. And I just remind them, like John chapter 9, you just quoted it. Yeah. Like the blind man, he had no idea what happened. Yeah. He was telling everybody about Jesus, and they were saying, what happened? And he said, I don't know. All I know is this: I was blind. This guy came into my life, and now I can see. And they asked him, what, three, 4 times in one chapter, and he just kept saying, I don't know. And so I think the Lord has kind of grown that in me. I still get anxious sometimes walking into conversations, and sometimes I'll catch myself even in having an encounter and realizing I've not spent any time actually talking about Jesus yet. And so I think that's a place I need to grow in my own life and need to pray about in my own life.
I think that's really helpful. So we're talking about practice, praying, asking for opportunities. What else comes to mind?
Yeah, so I think this is the big one for me, and I think this is probably the hardest one for people who may not have this drive in their hearts, because I know not everybody does, but I've come to the conclusion that I just need to say no a lot less. I rarely say no. And so I'll feel like the Spirit is saying in my heart, hey, you just passed a homeless woman on the streets, and I need you to turn around. And you need to give her something. You need to give her a word of encouragement. If you got a bottle of water, whatever that might be. And so I've found over the last 4 or 5 years of my life, the Lord has been putting more and more people in my path, and I just rarely say no. And so, for some of us, that might be, a neighbor who's just moved into the community that's from another country. It might be a mom that's at the bus stop, and her life is falling apart. But just being present with the people in front of me and just stepping into that.
I love that, and I don't want to touch on it now. I'm going to punt this one and end our conversation with this. But one of the things you touched on there is this notion that God is probably going to give you a particular calling. There's going to be some sort of sphere that you're drawn to. One of the things we'll touch on is like in this most recent season, you have felt a calling to be engaged with the homeless. It might be something else for some people, but there is a sense that, hey, God is going to wire you, God is going to position you, God is going to put you in a certain space, and he's going to give you a particular burden for a group of people. If you're praying, give me opportunities. If you're willing to say yes, that's probably going to happen. So let's keep going. What are a couple other practices, and then we'll circle back around to that.
I think one of the practices that has been very hard for me, because I can be very judgmental, is when you look at Jesus, the way that, kind of going back to the first idea or principle of posturing yourself, is I am very quick, Brad, to make opinions about people either around me or in the news or even in my sphere of influence, and I actually really don't know much about them. I can be quick to jump to opinions about somebody who has a different political bend, maybe a different idea of their own sexual identity bend. And so one of the things that I've really tried to incorporate in my life is I've really just asked the Lord to protect me from making judgmental opinions about large groups of people until I've actually made a friend that's in that group of people.
I think that's so important and so wise. I mean, how often do all of us, myself included, have so much pride that we make like these broad, sweeping assumptions about people, having not yet asked questions or listened, which is one of the things I think really frustrated some of the religious elite of Jesus' day. He was so patient to be around people who were, as far as the kind of common public opinion of the moral group of people of his day, they were out of step with that, but he would ask questions. He would be much more patient. I love that. So one of the things that I've heard you say and really do is, instead of engaging folks who might be in a different place because they don't know Jesus, they're not following Jesus, they don't have the same ethics as I do, et cetera, is instead of giving them good advice, I just share my testimony. Talk to me about that.
Yeah, then I think that's what makes it easier. So it kind of softens the blow. I think there is this feel for people who are living on mission, who want to bring truth. They feel like they've got to lay out the Romans road, or they've got to, lay the gospel out in a really theological way. And I will say 9 times out of 10 when I share the gospel, it's rarely theological, in the sense of somebody says to me, "You believe the gospel, what does that mean to you?" Yeah. Instead, usually it comes from someone's life is falling apart, and I share with them a time that my life was falling apart. Yeah. And what Jesus did in that scenario, or I share just a growth story. When you look at the Apostle Paul in Scripture, there's several places in the Pauline epistles where Paul describes the kind of man that he was before God and the kind of man that he is now. And so there's lots of ways to share your story. And the thing about sharing your own story is we live in a culture today where it's safe to do that, because everybody's okay with you being who you are and you following your truth. And so it really takes the burden off, because you can kind of step into a conversation and say, "Hey, I don't know where you're at. I don't know what God's doing in your life. I just want to tell you what God's did in my life." And it makes it easy. You don't have to remember anything because it's your story.
Yeah. So let's wrap up with this. I think there's something that God has done in you that I would like for you, if you're able to put it in words, share with our listeners, because I think he wants to do in me, in our listeners, what he's done in you, is God has given you this burden. And for some time now, I've watched you not just love homeless people from a distance, not just give some money to the local rescue mission, but you have actually gotten engaged and built friendships with homeless people. What brought about that burden, and what have you learned in trying to be obedient to kind of what God's put in front of you?
Yeah, I think about a year ago, maybe a little longer than a year ago, I've noticed here where we live in Knoxville, in the west side of Knoxville, the population of homeless is growing. And so I look at these principles and say, okay, how can I posture myself with this community? How can I not make prejudgmental opinions about them? How can I be engaged and actually walk in a relationship? So I did actually that. I felt like the Lord was saying, if you're going to get engaged, you got to do what you say you do. So I found a couple that was homeless, and this may sound odd, but I pulled over and I asked if they would be my friends. And I guess, sure, people will be happy.
That's not something the average person would do. Like, you're not average, okay, but you'd been praying, you've been asking it, and God said do it, and you did it, and you just took a step. You took a radical step of obedience. Yeah,
and I guess if you have a car, homeless people want to be your friend. So I did have a leg up. But so what I did is I asked if I could be invited into their life, if they could teach me a little bit of what's going on. And
all right, hold on. You asked them to teach you.
Yeah, I think one of my concerns was, again, going back to the principle of prejudging opinions, is if, like, the Lord is calling me to help with the homeless community, I should not guess what they might need. So we started doing, we set up every other week, we'd go to lunch, and I would ask them to share with me what it's like to live in a homeless camp, and the challenges of that, and, drug addiction, and the things that come with that. And then at the same time, they asked me to encourage them in their faith, which I thought was interesting. So at one point we said, we'll talk about their emotional relationship, and I invited them to start reading the scriptures with me. So every other week they'd read a chapter of Genesis, and we'd talk through it. And I just can't even imagine what a couple laying in a tent in the middle of the woods next to Interstate 40 would be like. I just can't even imagine what it would be like for them to be reading their Bible on the phone that they charged behind the JCPenney's, Yeah. And I think that's it. Like, I just postured myself with them along the way. I shared my story, and, my story is not I'm in a homeless camp, running from drug addiction. But all of us were at a place where we were in desperate need of Jesus. And so that's what I share. So we're on a journey. I'm probably a year into it. So you asked, what do I learn? It's messy.
Yeah.
It's hard. I mean, I never
You have
bailed.
not eradicated homelessness in Knoxville, have you?
Yeah, that's right. And it's about the person right in front of me. And so I didn't know much about drug addiction. I didn't know much about living in the homeless community. I've never bailed anyone out of jail before this. So it's the first time I've had a chance to learn that. And so I want to posture myself. I want to just be caring for the person in front of me, and then I just want to make sure they know the gospel. I cannot imagine relieving all of their physical poverty, but their spiritual poverty can be relieved in a relationship with Christ.
Over the last year, would you say that your love and compassion for these people has grown?
Oh, no doubt. I mean, it just changes your demeanor when you see somebody at the end of the exit ramp asking for money. It changes your demeanor when you think about how could, I said these sentences, how could these people get themselves in this position? And that's a pretty arrogant thing to say if you don't know who these people are. So, yeah, God's really changed my heart.
Yeah. You know their names. It changes everything. Well, if you're listening to this, it would feel like a failure for me if we talked about mission and the ways to practice it, and we just all said, hey, that was a good podcast. How cool it is that Kyle's loving homeless people. But Kyle, you gave us a practice that we can put into play right now. So if you're on the treadmill, or if you're driving down the road, or if you're just sitting at your desk and you're listening to this episode, like right now, stop and pray and say, Lord, who are you putting in front of me that you want me to purposefully and intentionally engage with the gospel? Is there a physical need? Is there an emotional need? Is there some unique opportunity? Just pray right where you're at. Ask God to show you that path, that person, those people, and then ask him to give you courage to take an obedient step towards that. Well, Kyle, thank you so much for sharing some principles, some insights, some conviction about why mission is so important, but also just some practical ways that we can get engaged on mission with Jesus amongst our neighbors.
It's been fun.
Well, folks, as always, thanks for listening and practicing with us. To make sure you get future episodes to Practicing the Practices, make sure you subscribe or hit follow on your favorite podcast platform. Until next time, this is Brad. Grace and peace.